As you are getting to your seats, let me set the stage for our fourth and final plenary speaker. Many of you are aware that Walter Bauer, the famous lexicographer, who wrote the lexicon which he was sniffed, as it is known by its English translators' names, Arnton Gingrich, and he said that he had worked 7 days a week for so many years and found that his name was not even credited with the lexicon in the English-speaking world. Walter Bauer was also a historian of religion who wrote a very influential work on orthodoxy and heresy in early Christian centuries. It was published in German. It was not translated into English until many years later, but it has had an enormous impact on the thinking of people like Helmut Kester of Harvard University and his student Elaine Pagels. And his thesis was that heterodoxy, as it's been called, heresy by some, was as early as orthodoxy, and in some cases might have been even more prominent. And one of the areas where he suggested that this was the case was Asia Minor. He compared the letters of Paul with the letters of Ignatius. We're privileged to have as our fourth and final speaker Paul Trebilco, who is from the University of Otago in New Zealand. Paul received his Bachelor's of Science from the University of Canterbury, his BD from the University of Otago, a PhD in New Testament Studies from the University of Durham. His dissertation was on the Jewish communities in Asia Minor. He's currently head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Otago. His monograph, based on his dissertation, was published in the SNTS series in 1991. More recently, in 2004, he published his work, The Early Christians in Ephesus, from Paul to Ignatius. This morning, he's going to speak to us on the subject, Gnostics in Asia Minor in the early 2nd century CE. Question mark. Ignatius and others, as witnesses against Bauer. We're very pleased to have him here this morning. Would you give him a warm welcome?
Thank you very much for the invitation to come and be with you for this conference. I hope you can follow my accent. It's 3 o'clock Saturday morning, New Zealand time at the moment, so I hope I am bright and alert and reasonably over my jet lag. I have more excuses for falling asleep than any of you, I think, at this present time. Walter Bauer's book, Rechtsgläubigkeit und Ketzerei in Altesten Crescentum, was published in 1934. The English translation, as we've heard, entitled Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity, published in 1971, gave the book a new lease of life. The book has had a huge impact on New Testament scholarship and on scholarship on the early church. And it's to this work and its legacy that I want to devote this paper. Bauer summarized his argument in this way. Perhaps, I repeat, perhaps, certain manifestations of Christian life that the authors of the church renounce as heresies originally had not been such at all, but at least here and there were the only form of the new religion. That is, for those regions, they were simply Christianity. The possibility also exists that their adherents constituted the majority, that they looked down with hatred and scorn on the Orthodox, who for them were the false believers. End of quote. Both chronological and numerical dimensions were important in Bauer's argument. He thought that what would later be called heresy was often primary, and hence the original form of Christianity, and that in some places and at some times, heresy had a numerical advantage and outnumbered what came to be called orthodoxy. The triumph of orthodoxy, then, was due in the end to the church in Rome. Bauer did not use the phrases lost Christianities or lost scriptures, but they are clearly implicit in his work. If heresy was the earliest form in some places, then it has a certain primacy, which suggests it should not have been suppressed, nor its writings lost. And if what became orthodoxy was a minority in some places, with heresy actually being dominant, then some would argue that the decisions in favour of orthodoxy can be seen as very political decisions, which may involve power and politics, more than a claim that this particular form of Christianity was a faithful witness to Jesus Christ. Thus, the claim that what became Orthodox Christianity involved the triumph simply of the winners gains much support from Bauer. But Bauer's thesis also raises the issue of the extent and nature of diversity in earliest Christianity. And it asks us to examine what might hold the movement together, and hence allow us to speak of unity. Bauer's work has been hugely influential, as we've heard a number of times at this conference. Writing in 1971, Jaroslav Pelikan could say that Bauer's thesis has shaped an entire generation of scholars since its first appearance in 1934. And of course, those scholars became the teachers of the next generation. In 1981, Robert Wilkin aptly said that Bauer had created a new paradigm. Koester explicitly follows Bauer's approach in a number of his works, and scholars such as Gerd Ludemann and Bart Ehrman show their support for Bauer. Bauer's influence continues to be alive and well then. Well, how did Bauer argue his case? He started with a geographical approach and investigated communities in Edessa, Egypt, Asia Minor and Rome. He discussed Ignatius in relation to Antioch and Polycarp in relation to Smyrna. He then turned to themes such as the influence of Roman Christianity, the use of literature in various conflicts, the role of the Old Testament, traditions about Jesus and about the apostles. In this paper, I'll focus particularly on what Bauer says about Western Asia Minor. This is an area for which we have very good sources, and so provides a useful testing ground for Bauer's thesis. Can Bauer's thesis be sustained for this area? If it does not hold here, questions are raised about whether it holds elsewhere, where our evidence is thinner. Here I'll draw particularly on Ignatius, but also on Revelation, and then more broadly on other literature from Western Asia Minor. So, Bauer's use of Revelation and of Ignatius's letters with regard to Western Asia Minor. How does Bauer use Ignatius's letters and other documents too in his argument? Here I'll argue that Ignatius is actually a witness against Bauer on 4 significant points, and I will draw also on Revelation. Firstly, the nature of Ignatius's opponents. Bauer thought that Ignatius wrote about one group of opponents in the churches of Western Asia Minor, and that they were what Bauer calls Judaizing Gnostics. Gnosticism in particular was regarded by Bauer as the major threat, and those groups which were not orthodox were generally seen by Bauer as Gnostics. There has of course been much subsequent study both of Gnosticism and of these opponents. It now seems most likely that Ignatius faced 2 sets of opponents. Judaizers in Magnesia and Philadelphia, the other Philadelphia that is, and Docetists in Charles and Smyrna, and of whom he warned in Ephesus. The identity of the opponents is significant with regard to discussions about the origin and development of Gnosticism, which has itself become a problematic category. It's important to note that most scholars would now want to argue that Ignatius did not face fully fledged, fully developed Gnosticism. But with regard to Ignatius's opponents, Bauer's thesis can be countered to some extent. One element of Bauer's overall thesis was that what came to be called heresy was the original form of Christianity. Is this the case where we can investigate it in Western Asia Minor? Well, in Revelation 2, 8-11, John writes to the church in Smyrna. The main issue seems to concern slander from the local Jewish synagogue. Nothing is said by John about Docetism, which features in Ignatius's later letter to Smyrna. With regard to Docetism, it seems clear that it only emerges in its most rudimentary form towards the end of the New Testament period. Hengel argues that Docetism is the result of what he calls the first Hellenization of Christianity. Hengel writes, Docetism, which did away with the scandal of the death of Jesus on the cross in the interests of the impassibility of God of the philosophers, demonstrates that these systems are secondary attempts at an acute Hellenization of the Christian creed. That is, necessary consequences of a popular philosophical influence. On many occasions in the Greco-Roman world, we come across the idea that offensive happenings should not be ascribed to revered divine beings or demigods themselves, but only to their representations. Thus, Martin Hengel sees in the view that Jesus only seemed to be of real flesh an attempt to accommodate Christian belief to Greco-Roman views about divinity, and thus to make Christianity compatible with a Greco-Roman mindset. Hence, the actual nature of Docetism itself seems to presuppose an underlying high Christology to start with. Jesus is first seen as divine, and then, as a subsequent move, and because of certain views of the incompatibility of true deity with real humanity, Jesus' humanity is seen as partial, or as an illusion, or it is said that he only seemed to be crucified. Accordingly, it's unlikely that Docetism was the first form of Christianity in any centre, whether Tralles or Smyrna or elsewhere. It's possible that Docetic teachers travelled to Smyrna from elsewhere, but we note that there is no hint of Docetism in John's earlier letter in Revelation to the community in Smyrna, which suggests that Docetism developed in Smyrna between 95, when John probably wrote Revelation, and 110, when Ignatius wrote. It's not then the original form of Christianity in Smyrna. Further, Ignatius writes of Judaizers in Magnesia and Philadelphia. We have no other information for Magnesia, but John also writes to Philadelphia in Revelation 3, and there gives no indication of Judaizers. This is not because John hesitates to point out the faults of the seven churches, far from it. So it seems unlikely that a Judaizing form of Christianity was the original form in Philadelphia. Hence we can counter Bauer's thesis that heresy is early, original and strong with regard to these two centres. Secondly, the churches to which John in Revelation and Ignatius did not write. Bauer thought that the churches to which John in Revelation and or Ignatius did not write were heretical. John and Ignatius, in Bauer's view, avoided these communities because they knew they could gain no support there. Hence, Bauer builds up a list of heretical communities simply by noting known Christian communities to which John and Ignatius did not send letters. For example, we know that a Christian community was established in Colossae by Epaphras and was addressed by Paul in Colossians. But neither John in Revelation nor Ignatius wrote to Colossae. Similarly, there was a Christian community in Hierapolis, as we learned from Colossians 4, which neither John nor Ignatius addressed. To explain this, Bauer writes as follows. John selected the most prominent communities from those in his area which met the prerequisite of seeming to afford him the possibility of exerting a real influence. Thus Bauer infers that John did not write to these communities, Colossae and Hierapolis for example, because they did not agree with him theologically, and so are to be seen as heretical. Bauer notes that Ignatius does not write to these communities either in 110. He writes, the community of Hierapolis and that of Colossae are bypassed in icy silence by both John and Ignatius. Well, what do we make of this argument? Colossae was overshadowed by nearby Hierapolis, and particularly by Laodicea, Laodicea being the most prominent city in the Lycus Valley by the Roman imperial period. Colossae was probably hit by an earthquake in 60 CE, but we do not know how quickly it recovered, since it has never been excavated. It's precarious in the extreme to argue that both John and Ignatius chose not to address the Christian community in Colossae because they knew it was heretical, and so not in agreement with them. It's just as possible that the Christian community was very small in the city, between 95 and 110, because of the slow recovery from the earthquake. What of Hierapolis? We learn of the Christian community in the city from Colossians 4, and it's likely that Philip and some of his daughters settled in Hierapolis sometime around 70. Papias, who wrote an exposition of dominical sayings between 120 and 135, was bishop of Hierapolis. Those three details are all that we know of the Christian community. To say that John and Ignatius avoided writing to the community in Hierapolis because of its theological position is possible, but given our very fragmentary knowledge, seems unwise. We should also note that scholars have had very different views about why John chose his particular 7 communities. It's possible that they were all on a postal route, as William Ramsay suggested, but positive evidence for this is lacking. Was it simply that as an itinerant prophet, these were the churches with which John had had regular pastoral contact? He knows their situation well, and clearly has had involvement with them in the past. There would be a limit to the number of churches with which John would have had such pastoral interaction. He may not have written to Colossae and Hierapolis simply because he did not know them well. They were not part of his circuit, as it were. But the fact that we can give a range of possible explanations for John's choice of churches, and hence for why he did not choose some other places, means that we cannot infer that the communities he left out were heretical. What of the communities addressed by John, but not by Ignatius? Ignatius writes to 3 of the communities addressed by John, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Philadelphia, but does not address 4 others, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, and Laodicea. Bauer writes as follows: Is it by chance that the communities of Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, and Laodicea are missing from Ignatius's audience, communities that John the seer vehemently rebukes? Is it too much to claim if, on the basis of what Ignatius both says and does not say, and considering the evidence of the Apocalypse, one concludes that in his attempt to stretch the circle of his influence as widely as possible, for the sake of his constituency, there was nothing Ignatius could hope for from the Christian groups represented at Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, and Laodicea, because no point of contact existed for him there. No bishop was present whom he could press into service, because the heretics had maintained or had come to exercise leadership there. End of quote. Bauer asks a question, but clearly the answer for him is yes. But we do not know why Ignatius chose to write to particular communities. Ignatius did not determine the route that he took through Asia Minor, nor do we know exactly what that route was. So it's futile, I suggest, to speculate that he went through a particular place and yet ignored the Christians there, or that there were other communities that he knew about but did not write to because they were heretical. This again is an argument from silence, and there are alternative explanations. Take Sardis as one example. John writes to Sardis, Ignatius does not. Does this mean that by 110 it had been lost to heretics, as Bauer suggests? This is possible, but again an argument from silence. We should note that since Bauer wrote, Miletos on the Pascha has been discovered. This is probably to be dated a little before 164, so too late to be decisive in this debate. The text does not explicitly refer to Christians in Sardis, but clearly it shows that there was a community of Christians in the city in the 160s. Whilst we cannot deduce from this sermon what the situation was in the city 50 years before, it is at least clear that in the 160s, Sardis was not a city which had only heretical Christians. Further, the discovery of Miletos' sermon reminds us of the fragility of Bauer's argument from silence. So the further evidence that has been discovered in Sardis since Bauer's time certainly does not support his view. But we can note that Bauer's argument from silence, which he used extensively, is fragile. We cannot say that there were heretical communities in Colossae, Hierapolis, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, and Laodicea, simply on the basis that John and or Ignatius did not write to these places. 3. Some disagreements with the bishop were related to church structure rather than to theology. Well, in Bauer's view, all Ignatius's letters to Asiatic Christians bear eloquent testimony to the dangers of heresy. End of quote. Bauer reaches this opinion in part by taking all dissension, all indications of conflict with the bishop, as evidence for theological disagreements between the Orthodox bishop and the heretical church members. Now, while clearly theological issues were sometimes at stake in the disputes that Ignatius reports, this was certainly not always the case, and Bauer overlooks this. I will argue here that on some occasions, the reason that people were opposing the bishop was that a change in church structure was occurring, with some Christians in Asia Minor disagreeing with these changes. This evidence for opposing the bishop is not evidence for heresy then. Let me briefly put this case. Evidence for Christians opposing the bishop comes from Ignatius's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 5. Let no one be deceived. Anyone who is not inside the sanctuary lacks the bread of God. For if the prayer of one or two persons has such power, how much more will that of the bishop and the entire church? Therefore, the one who does not join the entire congregation is already haughty and passes judgment on himself. For it is written, God opposes the haughty. And so we should be eager not to oppose the bishop, that we may be subject to God. Ignatius is referring to gatherings for worship here, as the reference to corporate prayer makes clear. The passage suggests that a small group of people are meeting together, but apart from the bishop and the rest of the church. This is implied by the phrase, for if the prayer of one or two persons has such power, how much more will that of the bishop and the entire church? These people who are praying together are not, however, joining with the entire congregation, which is the gathering under the bishop, since these people are said to oppose the bishop. We see then that some Christians in Ephesus had a measure of independence from the bishop. Ignatius also addresses this issue in his letter to Tralles. There he writes, the one who is inside the sanctuary is pure, but the one outside the sanctuary is not pure. This means that the one who does anything apart from the bishop, the presbytery and the deacons, is not pure in conscience. Again, it's clear that some people are acting apart from the bishop. Thus, people seem to have been meeting apart from the bishop in Ephesus and Tralles, and in each case, no doctrinal issue is mentioned. The situation was similar, though slightly more complex, in Philadelphia. Those who are meeting apart from the bishop are probably meeting separately in one or more house churches. But why did some Christians in these cities oppose the bishop? Why would they pray and worship apart from him and not come to the bishop's assembly or to an assembly authorized by him? Were they heretics? But no decisive theological difference is mentioned. Rather, I suggest, the evidence shows that this was a time of transition with regard to church structure, and that one reason that some were opposing the bishop was that they were resisting these changes. In Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians 6:1, Ignatius refers to someone being sent in this way. For we must receive everyone that the master of the house sends to take care of his affairs as if he were the sender himself. And so we are clearly obliged to look upon the bishop as the Lord himself. Here, using material from Christian tradition, Ignatius is saying that the bishop has been sent by God, the master of the house, and must be received by the Ephesians, since according to tradition, the one sent by God must be received as God himself. This and the comment that we are clearly obliged to look upon the bishop as the Lord himself suggests that some Christians in Ephesus disagreed that the bishop had indeed been sent by God, and so did not receive him. Ignatius argues that Onesimus, the bishop, should be received and his authority respected because he was sent by God. However, the passage suggests that one reason some Ephesians opposed the bishop was because they did not see the bishop as the one with God-given authority. This indicates that some Ephesian Christians were resisting a change in church structure, which involved the bishop claiming to have authority over all the Christians in Ephesus. Monepiscopacy would have been a significant development for Christians used to leadership being provided by a group of presbyters, with no one person being regarded as the leader of the leaders. Some Ephesian Christians seem to have argued that one bishop had not been sent by God and need not be received. They need not come to the bishop's assembly, but rather could continue to meet separately. This points to a time of transition, a transition that was resisted. The weighty justification that Ignatius gives for the office of bishop in his letters also suggests that this was a time of transition to a different leadership structure, and that some resisted this change because they wanted to hold on to a different church order. Ignatius envisages the bishop having very broad and widespread control over the life of the community, control that was much more extensive than we see elsewhere at this time. This suggests that Ignatius was trying to consolidate and extend the authority of the bishop over the life of the church. This evidence builds into a cumulative case that this was a time of transition. Ignatius knew that many of his addressees were acting apart from the bishop, but also that they did not think this was wrong. This suggests that some of his addressees were currently convinced about the rightness of a different church order, a more collegial model of church. Who were these Christians in Ephesus who were resisting such a change? We can suggest that some Christians in Ephesus may have wanted to resist this change to monepiscopacy because they valued their current system of church order. There are two possibilities here. One aspect of the opposition to the growth of the power of one bishop in Ephesus may have been from those who belong to the Johannine community, as witnessed to in 1 to 3 John. The evidence that this movement should be located in Ephesus is strong, and although they valued tradition bearers like John the Elder, they seem not to have had leaders who were appointed to particular offices, and the locus of authority was generally in the wider group. We can suggest that this group would have resisted the developments towards a more institutionalized church structure, including the development of monepiscopacy, with the bishop claiming to have authority over all the Christians in Ephesus at this time. They would have valued a much freer model of collegiality. Secondly, another dimension of this opposition may have been from those who valued the prophetic model of leadership demonstrated by John the seer in Revelation. It seems likely that at least some of John's readers in Asia were convinced about and valued prophetic leadership and associated charismata. It would be unsurprising if they opposed the bishop and felt free to act apart from the bishop and without his authority. This view is supported by the evidence that Ignatius was aware of the need to take account of the emphases of readers who valued charismata and found conducive the claim to prophetic inspiration, which is fundamental to revelation. And so Ignatius puts himself forward as one inspired by the Spirit and who has other charismatic gifts. Thus, Christians who appreciated John of Revelation may lie behind some of the opposition to Ignatius and his fellow episcopal officials. I suggest then that those who were opposing the bishop in Ephesus included some from the Johannine community, who may have been meeting in separate house churches, and some of those who had received the book of Revelation and valued the prophetic authority which is fundamental to that book. A similar situation may have occurred in Tralles and Philadelphia and elsewhere. Well, what does all this mean with regard to the Bauer thesis? Some of those who are in disagreement with the bishop are arguing about church structure and not about theology. They are not heretics, but advocates for a different form of church leadership. Bauer does not recognize this, but rather sees all opposition as theological. This means that he considerably overestimates the theological diversity amongst his addressees in Western Asia Minor. Actually, it seems much more likely that some Christians in Ephesus, Tralles, Philadelphia, and probably elsewhere as well, were resisting a change in church structure rather than being theologically at variance with their bishops. Bauer has misread the evidence at this point. 4. The memory of Paul in Ephesus. Bauer writes that in Revelation, the recollection of the Pauline establishment of the Church of Ephesus appears to now have been completely lost, or perhaps even deliberately suppressed. Now it is in danger of slipping into Gnosticism. And as far as Paul is concerned, in the Apocalypse, only the names of the 12 apostles are found on the foundation of the New Jerusalem. Revelation 21:14. There is no room for Paul. And at the very least, it will be but a short time before the apostle to the Gentiles will have been totally displaced in the consciousness of the Church of Ephesus in favour of one of the 12 apostles, John. In Ephesus, Paul had turned out to be too weak to drive the enemies of the church from the battlefield. End of quote. From the absence of the name of Paul in Revelation, Bauer concludes that Pauline influence was no longer present in Ephesus at the time that John wrote Revelation, nor did it continue into the 2nd century. Bauer concludes, I can understand this state of affairs only by supposing that in Ephesus, a community of apostolic origin has, through its struggle with external enemies, and above all through internal discord and controversies, suffered such setbacks and transformations that for many, even the name of its founder had been lost. This view became hugely influential in Henschen's commentary on Acts, for example. He follows Bauer completely on this point. But why does John not mention Paul in Revelation? Is it because Paul is no longer remembered there and has completely been forgotten in Western Asia Minor? The much more likely explanation is that John and some of John's readers know the Pauline tradition, but John has chosen not to speak of that tradition. It seems unlikely that Paul has been completely forgotten in Western Asia Minor. It's much more likely that John makes no use of the knowledge of Paul that he has. The reason for this is probably that John's main opposition in the 7 churches was the Nicolaitans, who were involved in eating food offered to idols and in idolatry. Scholars have often drawn parallels between the strong at Corinth and the Nicolaitans, and suggested that the Nicolaitans may have been influenced by Paul, or may have radicalized Paul's teaching. Thus, that the Nicolaitans may have been influenced by Paul or radicalized Paul's teaching. Thus, the Nicolaitans probably appealed to Paul for their support. In doing so, they almost certainly went much further than Paul allowed. But given their claim that Paul supported them, if John was to appeal to Paul in Revelation, he would be playing into the hands of the Nicolaitans, his opponents. They could claim, the Paul of whom you speak supports us. It seems reasonable to suggest then that John has avoided reference to Paul precisely because Paul is influential amongst John's opponents. Faced with this situation, the path of wisdom for John was not to refer to Paul. Bauer's view, then, that Paul is completely forgotten seems unlikely. And I'll note shortly that there is also positive evidence for Pauline tradition in Western Asia Minor through this period. It's very unlikely, then, that Paul was forgotten in Western Asia Minor. Pauline Christianity, we can suggest, remained influential. What then was the situation in Western Asia Minor into the early 2nd century? How should we think of the situation of Christian communities in Western Asia Minor into the 2nd century? Here I will be drawing on the other witnesses mentioned in my subtitle, Ignatius and others as witnesses against Bauer. I cannot develop this at length, but let me note some key points towards an alternative picture to that proposed by Bauer. I think it is incumbent upon us not simply to say why Bauer is wrong, but what a more truthful and correct picture might be. I'll discuss the evidence for the ongoing influence of both the Pauline and Johannine traditions, and then we'll briefly note the development of litmus tests or criteria of belief and action that demonstrate a growing concern for the delineation of orthodoxy in this area. So firstly, Pauline influence. I've noted that Bauer thought that Pauline influence vanished from Western Asia Minor by the time of Revelation. However, it seems clear that we have the following chain of Pauline influence in this area. In the early 50s, Paul established communities in Western Asia Minor. As part of the Pauline corpus, we have 1st and 2nd Timothy, which were written to Ephesus. If these letters were written by Paul around 65, they point to his continuing influence in Ephesus at the end of his life. If they are by a faithful Paulinist, writing in Paul's name perhaps around 80, they testify to the ongoing influence of the Pauline tradition at this date. Bauer gives no credence to this evidence since he dates the pastorals after 140. It seems likely that the writing of Acts, probably around 80, would have increased the profile of Paul. One of the places to which the book of Acts would quickly have been sent, and we know how quickly literature circulated amongst the early Christians, and where it would have been avidly read, was Western Asia Minor, which features so prominently in the story. That Polycarp seems to know Acts reinforces the early circulation of Acts in this area. It would quickly have supplemented the image of Paul amongst its readers. Bauer again overlooks the importance of Acts. Ignatius shows that knowledge of Paul was alive in Ephesus when he wrote. In his letter to the Ephesians, he writes like this: "You, Ephesians, are a passageway for those slain for God. You are fellow initiates with Paul, the Holy One who received a testimony and proved worthy of all fortune. When I attained to God, may I be found in his footsteps, this one who mentions you in every epistle in Christ Jesus." Bauer thinks that this in no way is based upon Paul's apostolic activity, but rather on the fact that the road to martyrdom, which Paul also travelled, leads past the city. But that Ignatius can praise the Ephesians as fellow initiates with Paul, Paulo sum mustai, and is clearly aware that Paul mentions the Ephesians in his letters, strongly suggests that the Ephesians Ignatius had talked to had spoken of this as an important matter to them. And we know that Ignatius spoke to a number of Ephesians. Ignatius knows that the reference to Paul will be well received amongst his Ephesian readers. It's evidence then for the vitality of traditions about Paul among some of Ignatius's readers. Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, whose letter to the Philippians can be dated with confidence to around 110 to 115, refers to Paul 3 times, including writing of the wisdom of the blessed and glorious Paul, which Polycarp says, "Neither I nor anyone like me is able to replicate." It's clear that Polycarp admired and valued Paul and regarded him as an authority. Polycarp knows a number of Paul's letters: Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and 1 Timothy, with use of 2 Corinthians and 2 Timothy being probable. But Pauline influence is not limited to particular allusions, since Polycarp is indebted to Paul for elements in his thought. As Lindemann notes, there is certainly no basis for the notion that Paul was forgotten or unimportant in the wing of the church in which Ignatius and Polycarp did their work. We have a strong case then for Pauline influence continuing in Smyrna at this time. Bauer again ignores this evidence. So it seems most likely that there was ongoing influence from Pauline thought in Western Asia Minor, from Paul's day through to the time of Polycarp. This is certainly more likely than Bauer's view that Paul was completely forgotten. This does not mean that some of Paul's communities did not encounter difficulties. Acts 20:30 speaks of false teachers and wolves. The fact that Luke includes this suggests that it was true in his time. But encountering difficulties with regard to false teachers is one thing. Completely losing all memory of Paul is quite another. We certainly have good evidence that suggests that Pauline Christianity was a strong and significant component of Christian tradition into the 2nd century in Western Asia Minor. Secondly, Johannine influence. Note also the chain of Johannine influence in Western Asia Minor. It seems likely that John, the author of the Gospel, arrived in Ephesus around the time of the Jewish War of 66 to 70. And there are very strong grounds for Ephesus as the place where John's Gospel was written, probably in the 80s, as argued recently by Martin Hengel and Richard Balcom. Slightly later, 1 to 3 John were written to communities in and around Ephesus and bear witness to the ongoing impact of Johannine thought in the area. Whilst Revelation is not written by the same person as the Gospel, it's clearly linked theologically to the Gospel and shows the ongoing impact of the broader Johannine movement in Western Asia Minor. The oldest clear allusion to 1 John is by Polycarp of Smyrna, writing around 110 to 115, as we've noted. Although Polycarp does not directly quote John's Gospel, the broader Johannine tradition, as shown in 1 John, is clearly known in Smyrna at this time. Hill has argued strongly that Ignatius knew the fourth Gospel. This relates more strongly to the situation in Antioch, but it's also relevant to Western Asia Minor. Papias of Hierapolis, who wrote between 120 and 135, gives the first 6 disciples in an order which reflects John's Gospel. And additional strong arguments can also be offered that he knew the fourth Gospel. There is also evidence for the knowledge of John's Gospel in the Epistula Apostolorum. Hill argues strongly for its providence in Western Asia Minor. It was probably written sometime in the 140s in Asia Minor, perhaps Smyrna, although it could be dated just before 120. Martin Hengel also writes this way: the special significance of the Johannine corpus, including the Apocalypse, for theology in Asia Minor becomes especially visible in the Paschal dispute and the Montanist movement. The typology of the Passover lamb and the chronology of the Passion of the fourth Gospel support the Quartodeciman custom of Paschal feasts as practiced in Asia Minor, following the 14th of Nisan for the Passover. The new prophetic movement, starting from Montanus and his prophetesses, could hardly have come into being without the link between the Gospel and the Apocalypse. In the Montanist prophecy, the Paraclete promised in the farewell discourses spoke to believers, and according to Maximilla, the heavenly Jerusalem of Apocalypse 21 was to descend in Papusa. This new prophetic movement, beginning about 115, already presupposes the Johannine Gospel. We see considerable evidence then for the impact of John's Gospel in the mid-2nd century. We have a chain of Johannine tradition in Western Asia Minor then, from the probable arrival of John in Ephesus around 70 to the Johannine community evident in 1 to 3 John, and then the continuing influence of the Johannine tradition in Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, the author of the Epistula Apostolorum, and the Montanist movement. By contrast, Bauer thought that none of the Apostolic Fathers had relied on the authority of the fourth Gospel, which he thinks was used predominantly by the heretics. This ongoing chain of both Pauline and Johannine tradition in Western Asia Minor strongly counters Bauer's thesis. He suggests that heresy, as we've said, is both early and strong. But here we have evidence from the 50s in the case of Pauline tradition, probably from the 80s in the case of the Johannine tradition, through to the 120s and into the mid-century, for the ongoing presence and importance of both Johannine and Pauline traditions in Western Asia Minor. As far as we can tell, both are ongoing traditions. And now, of course, there were strong counter-voices. The opponents combated in the pastorals, the secessionists mentioned in 1 and 2 John, the Nicolaitans, as we've said, the Docetists, the Judaizers, combated by Ignatius. Diversity there certainly is. But the presence of what became the Orthodox group, here represented by Pauline and Johannine traditions, is strong, early, and as far as we can tell, continuous. The strength and solidity of what we could call embryonic orthodoxy is thus, I think, impressive. I would suggest that this reconstruction has much stronger support in the actual textual evidence than Bauer's. My final section, discerning right belief and behaviour in Western Asia Minor. I'd like to touch on one other area in relation to Bauer's thesis. Recall that Bauer thought heresy was often early and in the majority. But note that in the New Testament literature from Western Asia Minor, we find a strong element of drawing what we might call exclusionary lines of belief and practice, and of drawing these lines in such a way that they are in continuity with later orthodoxy. This evidence suggests that as far as Western Asia Minor is concerned, orthodoxy is not a later imposition of an alien form, but rather a natural and organic outgrowth of something that has its roots in the New Testament period. Both the pastoral epistles and the Johannine letters were, as we've noted, written in or to Western Asia Minor, and with opponents in view. In the pastorals, we see the drawing of boundary lines around the group. And in the case of 1 John, a group had already left the community addressed, and the author shows what the basis for that departure had been. In both cases, we see what we might call lines of exclusion emerging. The opponents in view in the pastorals had an over-realized eschatology, having thought the resurrection had already occurred. They practiced asceticism, they maintained the validity of parts of the Jewish law, and their behaviour led to adverse comment from outsiders. In response, in the pastorals, we see boundary lines being drawn with regard to eschatology, asceticism, the law, and behaviour. For 1 John, the crucial matter was the Christology of the secessionists who had left. It seems likely that these secessionists so emphasized the divinity of Christ that they marginalized his humanity. In response, 1 and 2 John emphasizes the importance of the flesh of Jesus. Thus, these two groups, these two communities, are developing exclusionary principles of belief and practice, or can be seen as drawing the fault lines. One feature of this is developing litmus tests, to change the metaphor. Litmus tests that a group used with regard to their opponents, leading to their exclusion or their departure. This sort of drawing of the fault lines continues in Revelation and in Ignatius's writings in Western Asia Minor. Of course, drawing the boundary lines was happening elsewhere too, but it was definitely happening in Western Asia Minor. So in the literature from Western Asia Minor, we find a strong sense of applying criteria by which to judge whether, in the opinion of the author and his community, a certain belief or practice is in keeping with the tradition. This trend is consonant with the sense of the tradition, the sound teaching, the faithful sayings, or emphasis on the truth that we find in the pastorals and the Johannine letters. Most importantly, the links in this chain of belief and practice extend from these documents to what became orthodoxy in the later period. The fault lines, or lines of demarcation drawn by these New Testament authors to determine the limits of acceptable belief and behaviour, are in continuity with later orthodoxy. For example, in the pastorals, we have the affirmation of the goodness of creation in 1 Timothy 4, 1-5. Later affirmations against Gnostics are in continuity with this. And in 1 and 2 John, we have the affirmation itself forming a litmus test of the true flesh of Jesus. Again, the later affirmation of the true humanity of Jesus against the Docetists is in keeping with this emphasis on the flesh of Jesus in 1 and 2 John. Thus, roots of later orthodoxy are to be found here. Elsewhere, of course, but most definitely here. Orthodoxy is not to be seen as a later victory by the powerful, or as something determined by church politics. It goes back to and is an organic development from the much earlier period. And although in that earlier period it would be anachronistic to speak of orthodoxy, the polemic against opponents in the literature from Western Asia Minor reveals a strong sense of doctrinal self-consciousness on the part of these canonical authors. For the authors show that they are aware of holding a doctrinal or behavioural position that they wish to strongly defend. The sense of a limit, self-consciously adopted, is a very significant feature, I suggest, of this period in Western Asia Minor. And what is self-consciously adopted and defended at this time is in continuity with later orthodoxy. Accordingly, may I suggest we gain a quite different sense of early Christianity in Western Asia Minor from that given by Bauer. It would be quite wrong, I think, to see the period from 65 to around 135 and later in Western Asia Minor as originating with and dominated by heresy, or as a blur of different groups in which there was no attention given to right belief, or where there is no sense of the centre of the faith. Whilst there were noteworthy examples of what were regarded at the time as false belief, where we can judge the matter, this was not first, nor was it in the majority. And whilst there was significant diversity amongst groups that are found within the canon, there was also the strong sense of what we can call embryonic orthodoxy, found alongside the drawing of boundary lines of belief and practice. Very brief conclusions. I hope to have shown that Bauer's thesis does not stand up to scrutiny with regard to the situation in Western Asia Minor. Where we can investigate the matter, what Bauer calls heresy is neither the earliest form of Christianity, nor is it in the majority. None of this is to deny that there was significant diversity within earliest Christianity, both in the New Testament period and in the 2nd century, nor that there was theological development from the New Testament period onwards. But in his reconstruction, Bauer has overlooked some key elements of the evidence. Here we can most strongly test the Bauer thesis. Here it is found to be wanting. By contrast, in the period from round 65 to 135, we can argue that there were strong and influential voices which stood for what later became orthodoxy, notably voices standing in both the Pauline and the Johannine traditions. Further, in the documents bearing witness to these traditions, we find a strong concern to discern what the authors regard as acceptable belief and practice. Acceptable belief and practice that is in continuity with what later became orthodoxy. Orthodoxy can be seen as an organic development from this early period. The situation in Western Asia Minor, then I suggest, supports a quite different scenario from that proposed by Bauer. Thank you. Yes. Yes. I mean, the sort of conspiracy theory. The question is, does Bauer suggest that the evidence of the heretics was destroyed in this early period? Yes, most certainly. He sees the sort of classic conspiracy theory that there were lots of other documents. Most of them have been destroyed. We need to argue the case for the silenced voices. Which I guess is why he uses the argument from silence so much, because he thinks the silence was once voices that have been suppressed. But we have such a diverse range of evidence in any case that we would expect much, even some muted voices, I think. And as I say, I think he's misread the texts that he does deal with in many situations. Would the Didache represent a more collegial model? Yes, most certainly. Whether it had influence in Western Asia Minor, I think we don't know. I'm not sure whether Justin uses it or not. But yes, most would put it in Syria, wouldn't they? So I don't think we've got clear evidence that it went west, but it's certainly supporting the same sort of idea of prophets and a more collegial model. So it's a good parallel case for what we think is going on in Western Asia Minor. Thank you. Yes. Yes. I mean, in Antioch, for example, Bauer has a discussion on what he regards as a very sort of syncretistic religious environment, and then immediately jumps into talking about sort of syncretism in early Christianity. So I think he sees very much Christians being influenced by their local cities. It's an infuriating argument in some ways. He begins by saying that this is a time, he's writing in 1934, of course. This is a time of great pressure. Let's not waste our time on arguments that are presupposed and that we all accept, and let's just rush in. So there's lots of things that he accepts, that he takes as sort of givens in his scholarship, and then launches in. I don't need to explain that. You all know about this. Away he goes. So he's very much part of the history of religion school, I think, that would see most early Christian belief as sort of a construction from various elements around their environments. So I think his main answer would be this is syncretistic adoption of other views from the earliest from their environment, and early Christianity becomes the sort of some Christian but lots of other mystery cults and other religious influences that they've picked up from the earliest. With their earliest preachings of the Christian message, they would have absorbed these other syncretistic influences, I think is how he puts it. But he never directly answers that question. Yeah.
Let me make a final comment before we thank our speaker. I was at a remarkable session at the SBL honoring Helmut Kester of Harvard, who, of course, accepts the Bauer thesis, when his student, who edited his Festschrift, Birgit Pearson, publicly disagreed with Kester on the basis of Colin Roberts' study of the papyri of Egypt, arguing that orthodoxy was more prominent in Egypt than heresy. Let's thank our speaker.